So good evening, everyone. I am putting something in the chat right now. Oh, that's funny, Suzanne. Very funny. Okay, so good evening. I'm happy that you're here. I'm actually thrilled that you're here, and I can't wait for us to begin to talk and to learn. This is an integrated curriculum that was written several years ago at my alma mater, at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. It came out of many conversations that rabbis were having with the then chancellor about the changing, Dr. Arnie Eisen, about the changing nature of mitzvah in our lives. So this is hopefully a time to both study some traditional text and some modern writers, but also to think over many sessions about what mitzvah means. So one thing that we encourage for this is for you to keep a journal. And that's not something you may have with you right now, but maybe if you could go take just a moment and find yourself a piece of paper or a laptop or something that you could take some notes on if you wanted to do a little bit of journaling, because really this is about not just how we see the text, what the text says, but how we encounter the text and how the text changes us. So if you have a moment just to go back. I also want to say that usually I go around and have people introduce themselves. I'm not going to do that tonight, and I will tell you why. We have so much to get thinking through, but it doesn't mean I think you shouldn't introduce yourselves. You're going to just after our first writing piece. So we're going to do I'm going to give you a question, and I'm going to ask you to maybe write it. And if you don't want to write it, if you just want to think about it, and if we were all sitting together at the Jewish Center, I might say we'd take 10 minutes, but I think we'll take a minute or so. You're not going to have to share if you don't want to. And in fact, maybe we won't share. Okay. So again, this is from it's actually a 2-year-long curriculum called the Mitzvah Initiative. I'm choosing the parts of it that I think are quite interesting for moderns. So the first thing that I'd like to ask you to do is to think about a time when you were aware of making a change in your life. How did you come to make that change? And did it happen naturally, or was it a conscious process? And I'd love for you to write this down. And we're actually not going to deal with it tonight. But instead, actually, you might even want to write it in the chat, and Suzanne will save the chat. Or you can just write it down for yourselves. But I'd love you to save it. So a time when you were making a change, and did that change happen naturally, or was it a conscious process or a not a conscious process? I'll get some space of quiet. Okay, are we ready? Good, we're not going to share these answers. This is about how we do change and actually how change occurs in Jewish life or in all life. So the first thing I'd love for you to do is, if you want, you are welcome to say a blessing with me, but you could also say, you know what? I don't relate to mitzvot or to study as something that I would say a blessing over. right? Everything is open here because we are studying the concept of mitzvah. So the blessing is, Baruch atah, blessed are you, Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, sovereign of the world, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, who sanctifies us with your mitzvot, which I'm not going to translate, you are in a moment. La'asok b'divrei Torah, who encourages us or commands us or helps us or whatever to be asuk, busy with mitzvot. So if you'd love to say it with me, you know what? I can't type in Hebrew on this. I wish I could. I should be able to next time. Or if Gila, or if someone has a Hebrew typewriter, next time we'll have them type it in Hebrew. But you're welcome to join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're going to introduce ourselves, but we're going to be cognizant of how much time we take. And what I'd love for you to do is to say your name and to something you think about when you think about the word or concept of mitzvah. I'm not telling you that I need a definition or I need anything. It's something that you think about when you say or hear the word mitzvah. And then we'll go very quickly on to our first text. So you see, I sent the text for all 4 weeks. If we get through these texts quickly, we can go on to the first one for next week, which is by far my very favorite Jewish text of all time. So, okay, I'm going to call on people, but first I'll give you 20 seconds to think. What do you think about with the word mitzvah? I'll just call on your screen. You decide how you want to be called. I'm starting at the bottom. We're going, I'll start at the top. Mike and then Rochelle.
Mitzvah to me is doing good.
Okay, Mike, thank you. Rochelle.
I think also of doing good deeds, but I also think we used to have, when my kids were little, something we called Mitzvah Roundup. And my husband had an introductory poem that he'd written, yeehaw, it's time for Mitzvah Roundup. And we'd talk about the mitzvah that we did and somebody did for us that particular week.
Thank you. By the way, if you want to be called something different than your screen name, by all means. The Freeman's screen.
To me, mitzvot, I think of it, or a mitzvah, as two ways. It's things we are doing, obviously, that are good, but I also think of it as things that have come to me that are very good. And I think a mitzvah has been done for me, and then I am able to do mitzvot for somebody else.
Okay, thanks.
Marcia, and I think, well, Elliot's explanation was fantastic. I don't think I can beat that. But for me, I think it conjures up happiness.
Okay, great. It's, by the way, you did it right. It could be a definition like he did, or it could be just an emotion. Just real quick, because we're going to go around. So it's Suzanne and then Fran Machalise.
So what I think of is a warm feeling inside, either as a recipient or a doer.
Great. So Fran and then the Karp Oppenheims.
Right. Very similar. I feel it as fullness. And
Great.
goodness.
Good. Well, I think I'm back with Mike at the beginning. Everything that's worthy fits in the Venn diagram of mitzvah.
Hi, it's Linda. I would say it's holy action.
Someone should write some of these. They're amazing. Myra and then not Eleni. Neil.
I would add, that hasn't been mentioned, rituals that are prescribed in the Torah.
Okay, thank you. Remember, I don't care. You don't need to create a definition. It's either a feeling or whatever you want to say about it. So
Okay.
Thank you. Neil, then Hamuragila.
The mitzvah is a map for living. To paraphrase Rabbi Yogi Berra, when you come to the fork in the road, take the mitzvah.
Is my rabbi. Great. Gila, then Hamora Ellen.
Mitzvah is something I don't do enough.
Get me to feel a
Issar
little.
Kochek. Issar Kochek.
That's a good-
Hamora, Ellen, and then the Kramers.
Doing something that's beneficial to others that makes me feel good inside.
Health. You have to unmute. Saba, you have to.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't hear you. When I hear a mitzvah, I think you could be a better person.
And I think a mitzvah is an action taken by someone that evokes warmth in someone else.
Can you tell everyone your name?
I'm Peter Kramer.
Just go, so because just her name's there. Thank you. Sam. Sam, then Mickey.
Yes, Sam Daly Harris. Only thing that resounds in my ears is the 1950s definition, good deed.
Okay, Mickey, then Kathy.
And I think of it as coming from the heart.
Thank you. Kathy's screen.
I think of it as an intentional act of kindness in addition to everything that everybody else has said.
And there's someone with you.
Yes, it's my husband, Richard.
Does he want to go?
And I think of mitzvah as a good deed.
Thank you. Melissa, then Martha. But you're on mute.
Okay,
Yeah.
Melissa Pankove, giving back to the community and others.
Thanks. Martha, then Najat.
I think of something that makes me feel warm inside to be able to give it and to receive it.
Najat, who was at Shul this week and is new to the community, welcome to the United States. And then Jonathan.
Hi, thank you. I'm Najat. I'm from Morocco. For me, I think a mitzvah is doing something to make the world a better place.
Thank you. Jonathan, then Laura.
Hello, I'm Jonathan. I think about doing good from very small to very big things. And I also think in terms of like karma, like good karma.
Okay, thanks, Laura, then Jane.
I think about the idea of all of us having a spark of God in us, and a mitzvah being our ability to be like an agent of God in the world, and what he would want us to do in that situation.
Jane, thank you. Jane, and then Eleni, second screen of hers.
I'm not very creative. I just think of commandment.
I want what comes up. It's good. I'm happy to hear that word. Eleni?
Yeah. I think mitzvah is very much associated with community and connecting with other people.
Okay, thank you. Stephen and Michelle.
A spiritual act.
So I'll go along with a good deed, but in the back of my mind, I also know means commandment.
Debbie Dunn Solomon, and then Lee. Good to see you, Lee. Debbie, you're Hamora Devora, you are muted.
It's an action that helps a person, a situation. So, and sometimes not necessarily intentional. So you can say to someone, oh, you did a mitzvah. You made a difference.
Okay. So Debbie, then Lee, thank you. Lee, then Beatrice. Or Lana.
For me, virtue.
No, Lee Garber. Lee.
Oh, sorry. I thought you said Debbie was before me.
No. Go ahead.
So I'm Lee. I think of commandment, but also like a good deed, something that helps people maybe.
Thanks. And it says Beatrice, but I think it's Lana, right?
Yeah, it's me. I said, for me, it's virtue.
Virtue, nice. Sanjay.
My apologies, my camera is not working.
That's okay.
To me, it's doing some selfless action and expecting nothing in return.
Michael, and then the Lavid family.
Since we were created in the image of God, I treat it as if it's something that God would want me to do.
Okay, Lavid family, toda rabah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I take advantage of my Hebrew and mitzvah is a command.
Okay, so thank you. And the reason we opened with this is that I believe that definitions of words and of concepts are what you believe them to be. That's how words develop. You are right, those of you who said mitzvah is a commandment. That's where it comes from. But it may not be where it lands today. And some of the things that we're going to speak about is about how we see Jewish tradition, the word and the concept of mitzvah. Maybe it was commandment, maybe it has moved to become something else. So we're going to do that by reading some sacred and some modern text, although I guess modern text could be sacred as well. The text study was sent to you earlier, and it is also in the chat. I'm not going to share it. Instead, we'll invite you to read it on your own screen so that we can all continue to see each other. You might want to print it for next time or this time. This is Shir HaShirim Rabbah. So the Song of Songs. Who wants to tell us something about the Song of Songs and what's crazy about it being part of the Bible? What's Shir HaShirim? What do you know about it?
Is it a love poem?
Love, right? It is a love poem.
I believe it's somewhat racy for the Bible too, right?
It is racy. It's erotic love poetry. It is erotic love poetry. And many people say, whoa, after they read it, how did this make it into the canon? How did this make it into the Tanakh? Some rabbis give an excuse of how it made it in. Anyone know that big the reason they think it made it in? Yeah, Myra.
It's likened to the relationship between God and Israel.
Yeah, so it's seen about the relationship between these two lovers, God and the Jewish people. However, if you happen to have a beloved in your life and you've never read the Song of Songs, I heartily encourage you to get a good translation. I would recommend Marcia Falk's translation, F-A-L-K. She writes beautiful translation of Song of Songs into English, and it is something to share with your beloved. This reading of Song of Songs is really about that relationship between God and Jewish people. Would I have a volunteer who would read for us? And we'll read it in English. I have the text here for you in Hebrew if you'd like to see it, if that's easier for you. I'll always bring the text in Hebrew as well, but who could read it in English for us? I need a volunteer. Thank you, Linda. Linda, unmute.
Another explanation. For your love is better than wine. The words of the Torah are compared to water, to wine, to oil, to honey, and to milk. To water, all who are thirsty come for water. Just as water stretches from one end of the world to the other, so the Torah goes from one end of the world to the other. Just as rainwater comes down in drops and forms rivers, so with the Torah, a person learns 2 rules today and 2 tomorrow, until the person becomes like a flowing stream. Just as with water, a great person is not ashamed to say to a lowly person, "Give me a drink of water." So with the words of the Torah, a great scholar must not be ashamed to say to a lesser one, "Teach me 1 chapter, or 1 statement, or 1 verse, or even 1 letter."
Okay, so I'm gonna forgo the question that's written here and just first ask you, first of all, have you seen this text before? Okay, so the text that it is commenting on is this line, "For your love is better than wine." Beautiful one lover saying it to another. And now what is this love? It's Torah, right? It's Torah. And what are we saying about Torah and how we relate to Torah, or how we relate to mitzvah even?
That it's intoxicating like wine.
Uh-huh. That's a beautiful way of thinking about it, that it's intoxicating.
And
That
perhaps addictive.
like wine also may be addictive.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that wine in the rest of the text sort of gets pushed to the side for water. And of course, water is life-sustaining and nourishing.
Right. And we actually think of Torah more as water than as wine.
Right.
Right. So that is the part that we want to deal with. Why do you think the change happened between the wine into the water here? Because Midrash of all sorts, the rabbis making stories that changes the text meaning a little bit, that gives us a new understanding of the text meaning. So you recognized, Fran, very quickly, the author of the Midrash leaves wine. Why? Mike, do you have your hand raised? We can't hear you, Mike.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
wine is sweet, as is the Torah, but water is more available. And anyone can get it.
Okay, water is more available. Good. Anyone else about water? Fran gave that water is sustaining. Mike says water is more available.
Well, wine can be abused. You know, it's not necessarily a positive all the time.
Right? There's definitely people can abuse that. So now I want to go, now that I've highlighted this a bit, Dr. Karp, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, of course, you can't survive without water. You have to have water. It's no life without it.
Right, you have to have water. What did the author of this text, so I'm looking now at what the rabbis did in this text. The rabbis, the ancient rabbis who wrote this text, which was a commentary on the actual Bible. What does change look like for them? What's the change that they made?
Sure.
Well, there's one change was from the wine, they go into the water. What other kinds of changes are in this text?
It focuses on learning.
Just as rain, who said that? I couldn't hear it. Oh, you're right. It focuses on learning, that learning is somewhat like rain. I'm going to go to the second paragraph again. Just as rainwater comes down and drops and forms a river, so too the Torah learns 2 rules today and 2 tomorrow. By the way, how do you translate rules? It says halachot, hilchot, or halachot. They mean mitzvot, until the person becomes a flowing stream. The ground, the earth is changed by the rainwater. What happens to the ground when the rainwater comes?
It softens.
Softens, fertile, becomes fertile.
You get plants.
It softens, it's fertile, it becomes plants. Have any of you ever been in the desert, either in the United States or in Israel or any desert, when it rains? When those flash floods come in the winter? It's actually a little bit dangerous because the terrain totally changes. Just as rainwater comes down and forms rivers, learning Torah, or what the commentator is really getting at is doing mitzvot, doing Torah, will in some way change you. It's similar, the Torah and the rain are similar. The rain will change the landscape. The Torah, or learning Torah, which is the ultimate mitzvah, learning Torah will change you and me. Let that sink in for a minute. Mike, did you have a comment?
Yes, it's building relationships, sacred relationships between couples too.
Tell me more about that.
Well, when you have matrimony, you're both pledged to each other, just like there's a covenant there, just like there is between Hashem and Israel.
And this text, thank you. And this text in particular talks about how when we encounter something else, we are necessarily changed by it. So the water changes the landscape, the Torah changes you. Doing a mitzvah changes you or me.
And the more water there is, as we're seeing in weather and in California, the more powerful it becomes and stronger. So the more Torah, the more powerful and stronger and enhanced you become.
Well, it's interesting, Ellen, that you say that, because in many ways, an overabundance of water leads to terrible things. So one could make that same argument potentially about Torah, right? Not having a, Rambam, Maimonides would say, not having a balanced life. If you're sitting and studying Torah all day, but you're never doing art, or you're never working out, or you're never eating or making a friend, maybe that's too much Torah. Maybe that's the flood that washes things away. So there the metaphor goes on. Okay, so what do you think about this text before we move on to another text? And why do you think they brought it? To think about mitzvah.
I don't quite understand why in the third sentence, it's the great person not ashamed to say to a lowly person, rather than the other way around.
Ah, okay. Anyone want to help with that? So, yeah, Mike.
Well, the lowly person can approach the great person too, also, because they may have something to offer.
So, it's this, who wanted to jump in?
Oh,
Okay. Wait, Gila, then Jane.
So the natural thing is the big to the small, but the unnatural, the more powerful is the small to the big, or the one who know less to the one who know more. But you always can learn, even from people who are knowing less than you.
Right, or knowing different than you. And I think they feel like, when I've studied this text before, I think that they are very insistent on having us understand that Torah
is for everyone.
So large and immersive that someone could have not spent 9 years at the seminary learning Torah, but have a Torah to teach me. I assume that you all have Torah to teach me. And I assume that when Gila is teaching her B'nai Mitzvah students, every once in a while they teach her something. Like, that's just how Torah learning works. We learn from our students. In fact, in Pirkei Avot, we learn that. Sam.
Yeah, I've read it.
Oh, wait, Sam, hold on. Jane was up and then Sam. Sorry.
Well, I was going to just say, similar to what Gila said, that it says the lowly person should not be, the scholar should not be ashamed. He shouldn't be arrogant, and he should be open to learning from somebody who nominally knows less than he does.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, I read it as a call to less arrogance and a call to listening.
Amen. And a call to hearing. Like, the other question always we want to ask when we're reading sacred text is, why did the Midrashes put this paragraph after the one that just came before? And so that answers this question of, okay, we want people to be great in Torah, and we also want them to be not arrogant in Torah, to be humble in the Torah they have. Beautiful, beautiful. I'm going to go on, and because we have a few more texts to do. Dr. Barry Holtz is a professor at JTS, and he really writes about how we understand text in our lives. And I think this particular text really talks about what it means both to study, and when we think about study, we think about mitzvah as well as commandment or as Jewish action. So could someone read about morasha, the inheritance? This is a quote from Dvarim, from Deuteronomy, a morasha of the congregation of Jacob. You know this phrase, morasha kihilat Yaakov. So Rabbi Holtz, Barry Holtz, is writing now about that verse. Who could read for us? Thanks, Ellen. Najat, we'll get you next time. Ellen, okay, go ahead.
This shows that the Torah is the treasured inheritance of Israel. To what may this be compared? To a king's son who, when small, was taken away into captivity to a country across the sea. If he wants to return, even after 100 years, he will not be embarrassed to do so, because he can say, I am reclaiming my inheritance. It is the same with a wise teacher of Torah who has turned away from the words of the Torah in order to deal with other matters. He will not be embarrassed to return to them if he wishes to, even 100 years, after 100 years, because he can say, I am reclaiming my inheritance. That is why the Torah even says, Moses commanded the Torah to us, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob.
Okay, what's an inheritance? What's an inheritance? Not the money. Nothing to do with a probate lawyer.
The
It's
heritage.
and a tradition.
It's something that's been designated for you. Whether you accept it or not, it's been assigned, it's been given to you.
Yeah, so something that's been given to you, and you can choose to take it or not. And so what is this text saying about the inheritance that Kilat Yaakov, that the people of Israel have?
It's like a spiritual DNA.
A spiritual DNA that it does not matter, by the way, if you're born Jewish or you convert to Judaism. It's what Jews inherit, what we get from the generations before, all of them.
Wisdom.
So do you ever find, or have you ever found that part of our Jewish inheritance has held you back in some way? Or could hold you back? Please be totally honest. Or think about it.
That's part of my reaction to kashrut, is that it separates us from other people. If you're following the rules of kashrut, it really limits interactions with people who aren't Jewish or people who aren't following those rules.
Yes, and actually you're right. You got the point. That's what it's supposed to do, right? Because the word kadosh, what does the word kadosh mean? Please don't say holy.
Separate.
Separate. Separate. So yes. Yeah. So are you saying that your inheritance of this particular mitzvah makes you not be able to then be totally universalistic?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it's something that so many of us on this screen grapple with, which is what is ours? And can we have things that are uniquely ours without being offensive to other people's around us? How do we call ourselves a special people while acknowledging there are other special peoples? By the way, if you're wondering, that's what I just said it, and the way I said it is a very Mordechai Kaplan way of saying it, right? That the Jewish people can be special, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, and other peoples can be special for what they have. It's not traditional Jewish view of it. Traditional Jewish view would be, yeah, it's meant to keep us separate
But it's in Amos as well about, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, but I brought these people out of here and those people out of there. So even in ancient times, it was stated that way.
Yes, it was. It doesn't have to be you are special and no one else is special. It can be there are other special peoples.
And it doesn't have to be you're better. Special does not have to be better. It's different, but not better.
Right. And in fact, my favorite thing is during the story, the binding of Isaac, right? Abraham asked, which son of mine? And the Midrash says, your beloved son. and Abraham says, no, they're both beloved. One is beloved to this mother, one is beloved to this mother. They're both beloved. Interesting. So do you think, and you don't need to answer this question right now, but think about it. How could we think of mitzvah as part of our inheritance? I want to use, who gave the definition of Jewish action? Someone said that, I think.
I said holy action. I don't know if that's the same.
Holy action, Jewish action. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to read a different piece by Holtz, and this piece is going to give us some sense of the tradition that we have, what we've inherited, and what we do with that when it either changes or it doesn't change. So text number 3, how we negotiate with tradition. Who would, and actually, one of the things I'll ask you to do is think about the relationship between your own actions and Jewish tradition and how they change. So rather than thinking of Jewish tradition, capital T, as something that never changes, how could we think of Jewish tradition as something that actually is always changing? Right? Usually we think of mitzvot as static and Torah as static. And I think that first text from Song of Songs that told us that Torah is like water, also shows us that it's moving, it's changing, changing the landscape. How does Jewish tradition change the landscape? Jane, did you want to read or did you want to talk?
I just wanted to say something, but I could read too.
No, talk first.
I mean, but Torah is not only what's written in the Torah, it's the discussion about the Torah and the learning that you do. So it's very dynamic. It's not static.
So that is a really important point that you study Torah actually, and you read Torah beautifully most weeks here. So thank you for being a great Torah reader. One of the things that we all have to, sometimes people will say things, even in our very progressive community, people will say, it's our tradition to do X. You ever heard people say that? And I'll be like, well, how long has that been a tradition? Like 50 years? 100 years? Because within the span of Jewish tradition, that's like really little. Yeah. What does it mean to have a tradition that is an inheritance, but also one that changes and that is always changing? Okay, this is, by the way, from someone who doesn't do change well. I think I live far from where I grew up, which I know I don't. So who would like to read the next text from Dr. Holtz?
I can read.
Okay, and maybe let's do a paragraph at a time.
Okay. The problem with tradition, of course, is the problem of power. What tradition seems to be saying is, I have the truth, I have the final word, and your role is to accept what I am giving to you. But I suspect that very few of us today are going to accept unreservedly that position.
Stop. Don't you love that the people in my seminary, where all your rabbis and cantors come from, and educators are writing this? The problem with tradition is power. Like, we talk about how important mitzvot are, but let's be real. How many mitzvot do we do? Or more than how many mitzvot do we do? How do I, as a modern, relate to that big T tradition? Anyone have anything they want to say about this paragraph before we continue with after Dr. Holtz's audacious statement?
Yeah, no, I do. I think it's a way, it's a very, it affirms something. It's a way of saying that transgenerational powers, the way what you've inherited, aren't just something to be looked at, they're something to be honored. And therefore, people who don't have those same advantages from their own traditions are to be dishonored.
Huh. I'm not, explain that a little more for me.
Well, it firms up, it codifies transgenerational power because you have a tradition that X, Y, and Z are the way you do things are X, Y, and Z. And X, Y, and Z have provided me with something that you who are working with HIJ do not have that power and therefore must be disregarded.
Thank you for the clarification. Eleni says you have your hand. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think tradition is always associated with power. This idea that, you know, you don't make a law that people won't follow, right? Because people will vote with their feet. So I think there are a lot of traditions. Some are more, you know, less high stakes, like a tradition of how to, you know, how to make the best kugel. There could be a tradition about that, but there could be a tradition in a community about how to do things that may have gone bottom up and not necessarily top down. So it's just expanding this notion that it's a problem of power. I kind of see it differently.
Well, and Eleni, adding to that is that we just lived through 2.5 or 3 years where much of tradition of how we do things in Jewish or synagogue life was upended.
Exactly.
By virtue of the fact that we spent 2.5 years on Zoom.
So a lot of what becomes tradition probably often has lots of long negotiation, you know, and if you look way back, it looks like there, you know, it was something more fixed than it was at the time, something like that.
I think what Dr. Holtz is actually, he's agreeing with you. He says, but I suspect very few of us today will accept that universally. And we know that that wasn't just then, right? Because we know that there was an Enlightenment period where people left traditional religion. And then there was the Reform movement where people opened up and said, I think the way the tradition's being observed isn't right. And then there was the conservative movement that said, I think the way that Reform folks are doing is too much change out of tradition. So he says very few people, but probably in many generations, we don't just accept traditions. Sometimes we move on. We add our own selves to them, that intergenerational piece. Okay, let's keep going. Jane, are you reading? Jane?
Yeah, here, I
Okay.
thought you wanted to change readers.
No, no.
Ajit wanted to read.
Yeah, I'll get her in the next one.
Where are we?
Is there a source of truth?
Right.
You're on mute, Jane.
Okay, sorry, I was confused. Is there a source of truth? Can we get the right answers? As long as we remain committed to our own populist or democratic ideals, we are not going to find any easy answers. But perhaps the idea of tradition itself can offer a kind of midway solution if we think about it in a different way. I am drawn to a definition of tradition that resembles the way in which psychologist Jerome Bruner speaks about culture. Bruner talks about culture as transactional, something that is constantly in process of being recreated as it is interpreted and renegotiated by its members.
Keep going. Yeah, keep going.
If for culture we read tradition, we come up with something different from seeing it as a fixed source of unchanging authority. Rather, viewing Jewish tradition in this light, we can see our task as conducting an ongoing conversation between ourselves and that tradition. At times, we will bend our wills to the demands of the tradition. At other times, like Akiva teaching in front of Moses, we will reconceptualize what the tradition itself is. Judaism becomes the grounds for a living debate and deliberation in which we share power with the tradition rather than live under its unbending authority.
Okay, reactions. Yeah, Elliot. And then
To
Neil.
bring up, there's a very interesting book called, by Eric Hobsbawm, called The Invention of Tradition, which actually speaks to this. And it shows how traditions evolve and are invented all the time. And in a way, the comments from Holtz, in a way, kind of talks about that we are conducting it on an ongoing basis to establish, in a sense, what is tradition, and almost in a way we're negotiating with it. It's like, what is tradition and what fits our current life?
Yes, there's a back and forth. So I just want to thank you, and you'll send me a link to what the book is. So Neil, Lit, and then Fran.
This text has a premise that creates its own difficulty by assuming that tradition is an unbending authority.
Neil, you're reading this like Gemara.
Well, it's a habit, but it's a tradition. Yes, and certainly when you bring in Rabbi Akiva, you're bringing in the Gemara. But that's the tradition. The tradition is to look at the current situation and see that it both resembles and digresses from the moment when the Torah made a law that appeared unbending in its time.
So Neil, I'm glad you're the one who said this. Neil is someone who studies Gemara and teaches Talmud, teaches it. And so he already knows this. And I think that Dr. Holtz is bringing this to, when he wrote it in 1990, for a generation of folks who may not have your expertise in how Jewish tradition, especially in its really formative rabbinic years, right? If you read Mishnah and Talmud, that is when Jewish tradition is at its height of formation. And so you intrinsically know through the study of Talmud that you do every week, that the action of creating tradition is an action of change and an action of conversation. You know that because you do that. I'm not sure everyone.
Yeah, and I wouldn't know if I hadn't read Barry Holtz. So.
Well, I'm not sure everyone knows that, but I think that that's one of the things that happens when you study Talmud on a pretty regular basis, is that you get this deeper understanding that the tradition is always changing, because it is always encountering some new either generation or idea or something. Okay, Fran, you were next. Thank you so much.
Okay, this is just small, but this is a standard anthropological definition of culture. All cultures change. But the thing I wanted to add here.
Can you tell people that you're not an anthropologist?
Yes, I'm an anthropologist. Okay. But the one thing I wanted to add here that maybe just gives it a slightly, just a little bit of some depth, is that when they talk about culture changing, culture to me, and this is not a standard, is one of the definitions of culture, there are lots of them, is a system of meaning. Mm-hmm. So culture is what provides people with the framework for how to make sense of their worlds. So here you're talking about it being transactional because things change, and what are people doing? They're creating new meanings for themselves to make life not just meaningful, but to make sense out of life, their world, and whatever. So I think the fact that culture is being used there is important.
I absolutely agree, because we're talking about, most of us, even if we're religious Jews, we're cultural Jews, actually. Mm-hmm. Even those of us who live our lives according to Jewish law, we actually live our lives according to Jewish culture, and probably American Jewish culture. Even if we're Israeli, because we're living here, it's American Jewish culture, maybe tinged with some Israeliness. Or for me, tinged with the Israeli pieces that I get when I go there. Or for Najat, who's from Morocco, she's living Moroccan Jewish culture. Now she's here. Najat, you're going to be our next reader. But I want to say that I kind of just love this idea of, it says in this text, like Akiva teaching in front of Moses. So there's a beautiful, Neil, do you want to tell that story? Should I tell the story?
Oh, please go ahead.
So Rabbi Akiva, goes into the, is teaching in front of a Beit Midrash. Moses is in heaven, and Moses says to God, how will I know if my people have learned anything, or still Jews, or still doing my tradition? And basically the story is they are talking about stuff in, this is a couple thousand years, 1,000 years, maybe after Moses lived in Rabbi Akiva's study house. And basically Rabbi Akiva says this halakha, this law, can be traced back to Sinai and Moses. But it's really very quite different than anything Moses heard, but he knows there's a connection. So we know there's a connection. I got to say, one of my most interesting things for sort of modern Jews of our egalitarian ilk is when people will say things like, oh, you don't have a traditional service because you're egalitarian. Don't you look at the people who say that and you're like, our service is pretty traditional. This is how people have been doing it for now, I don't know, 40 years. This is how we do it. How long does it take in Judaism for something to become a tradition? Anyone know the number? It's called having a chazaka. 3 times. You do something 3 times. So if you come to shul 3 weeks in a row, we're going to expect to see you in the 4th week. It's also about if you decide to eat kosher food 3 times in a row, we think the next time you'll eat it as well. Traditions can be born and take hold pretty quickly. Okay, so our last,
Can I say something?
Of course, who's speaking?
Rochelle.
Rochelle, thank you.
It seems like if everyone is negotiating their own traditions, and this may be what we are doing now, but there is a problematic possible slippery slope of how do we unite, like what is binding us together? Everyone kind of wanders into their own tradition.
Rochelle, I promise, and everyone else, I promise that I did not pay and will not pay Rochelle for having said the most perfect thing at this moment. However, thank you.
You're welcome.
The text we're moving on.
I will still expect my payment though, even though
coffee, whatever. The text that we're moving on to is going to speak about, okay, but we don't all get to decide for ourselves. There is a role of community. And so we're going to go on to this second to last text. I think I have you to like 8:15, I think. Neil, is your hand raised or was it raised from before?
No, it's raised about the story of Rabbi Akiva.
Okay, go ahead.
Just very, very briefly, I love that story. And I've used it for years and years and years in my own teaching and learning. But I came across a different understanding of it among the Orthodox, which is that the reason that Moses did not recognize the teachings from Sinai is because he visited Akiva's classroom before he had been on that second trip to Sinai. They are defending the power, the irrefutable power of tradition. So we as Jews do not, as a complicated, diverse people, have a single understanding of that story.
That's beautiful. Also, I can't even imagine how that understanding would be the right one. So thank you for bringing it, because now I'm going to call some of my Orthodox friends and say, huh? Or ask them to do that. Okay, so I want to introduce you to Dr. Eisen. How many of you have ever studied with or from Dr. Arnold Eisen? Okay, good. Were you at the seminary, Michelle, when he was there?
No, but I took a class from him at the first National Chavurah conference.
Cool. Yeah. So I can proudly say that he grew up in Philadelphia, and he was his work, I believe, was done in Hebrew U, and then he was a professor at Stanford of Jewish Studies. And when the seminary went looking, I guess in the early 90s, for mid-90s, for a new chancellor, no, maybe later, they asked him to be chancellor. He's not a rabbi. He's the first non-rabbi to be the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But he is a lay conservative Jew. He was active at his conservative synagogue. And both growing up and as an adult, he was a member of the conservative shul in Palo Alto. One of the books of his that is less scholarly, although it's a little scholarly but more for the people, is the book this comes from. And I want to show you the cover and say, buy it and read it. It is just magnificent. This is what the soft cover is. It is Arnold Eisen, Taking Hold of Torah, Jewish Commitment and Community in America. And on a sociological level, he goes through each book of the Torah and comments on what it's like to live in America as Jews today. Taking Hold of Torah. He uses a play on the words Lamachazikim ba, those who take hold to the Torah that we sing in the Torah service. He was, I would say, a breath of fresh air at JTS and brought new, open, and interesting ideas. He is now not chancellor. He retired from being chancellor, but he's still a full professor and can be seen teaching on ScholarStream, which is United Synagogue and JTS's offering where anyone in the country who's a member of a conservative shul can take their classes. So let's answer Rochelle's question a little bit, that how can it be just whatever the heck each individual decides? Najat, would you like to read? And Najat is new to our community, right? When did you get here from Morocco?
I didn't come directly from Morocco.
Okay.
I lived in other countries before, but I moved here in August.
Okay, and she somehow found Zamru and was here with us for Zamru and here Friday night, and now she's here with us. So Najat, welcome. All these people are around the Jewish Center. They want to welcome you and welcome you to the community.
Thank you.
Let's read.
Okay. Every Jew brings different gifts and needs to the study and living of Torah. The decisions that we make for Judaism are highly individual. They begin in the particular families and communities that have nurtured us. We cannot but bring our personal stories to the larger story that our people has been telling for many centuries. We start where and as we are, take on the tradition as we find it, one by one, commit differently to the same covenant, and so inscribe ourselves in the never-ending story of the Jewish people and its Torah. What we add to that larger story, how we take it forward, will of course vary with our distinctive points of origin.
So I'm sure that the sociologists and the anthropologists who are on tonight will find this lovely, what he wrote. I certainly do. Really, he's recognizing that when we say Jewish tradition, we actually mean this very, very rich, multifaceted thing that includes everything that all of you do. All of the traditions that you do in your lives. And by the way, that could mean having a spouse that's not Jewish and creating a Jewish home. That is now part of Jewish tradition. That's who we are today. That could mean choosing Judaism as an adult and converting to Judaism. And then you bring your traditions. You know what I always say about Jews of choice? They never hated Hebrew school, which is great. They come to it not having hated Hebrew school. So it's about what each one of us brings, both as humans and as Jews. Jewish tradition is not only what we would study in a Bible class, but also what the Jews do, who we each are. Does anyone want to say anything more about Dr. Eisen's writings, Arnie's writings? Okay, I can't say enough about how you should read this book. It's so gewalt, wonderful. Okay, so Najat, could you keep reading? Because we could have you read all night and just listen to you read because your accent is so beautiful.
Thank you. It is absolutely fundamental to the vision of tradition and community to be set forth here that one never signs once and for all on the bottom line of a contract titled Judaism, agreeing to abide by a set of truths entailed therein. Rather, one embarks on a lifelong journey paralleling Abraham's that necessarily joins creativity with what is given.
Okay, who would like to respond to Dr. Eisen? Anyone want to say anything about what I will, but I'm happy to hear what you want to say first. Suzanne.
So based on your comment about just of choice not hating Hebrew school, this is a perfect thing to say to my spawn, who have kind of
Your spawn?
eschewed my spawn, who eschewed, religion and Judaism to an extent. But it's true, you don't sign and say, I'm going to do everything as it's written. You can take a baby step and then keep moving on. But I really like that there is the contract is in flux.
Well, developing, constantly developing. Okay, so I'm going to go Jonathan Resnick, Najat, and then Bob Karp, then me. And am I good till 8:15 or 8:20? Cool. Go ahead. Because we're gonna end with the most beautiful text in all of Judaism. Go ahead. Jonathan.
I don't want to delay that.
You're not. Go.
The traditions I would argue are somewhat secondary or even a facade to, like, another word might be pillars or core ethics or good, to do good. It seems to be secondary. The traditions are much less. That's not what has to bind us. It could instead be ethics or another word for that.
Okay, so it could be ethics, and generally what the anthropologists and sociologists will tell us, and Fran, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that we learn our ethics generally and our value system through the doing of things, so traditions. So here's a good example of how we are bound together by a value, but not by an action. So when someone is sitting Shiva, and they come back to sit Shiva, and they are Ashkenazi, what is often put on their table? If you're the Shiva lady or the Shiva guy preparing a home for someone, and that family is Ashkenazi, we will often put hard-boiled eggs on their table. You were about to say it, Michelle?
Yeah.
Stephen.
Stephen, great. So who would like to say that is not what the Sfaradim and the Mizrahim do. What do they put on the table? What's their tradition?
Dates, pomegranates.
A hit. How do you say chickpeas? They put hummus. They put round hummus. It's the same value where they're teaching that the life is circular and souls go in this world and out of this world. Their traditions, how they observe it, are a little bit different. They each use something circular. One uses an egg, which has to do with rebirth, but also circular. In the same way, Christianity took that same egg and used it for something similar. What?
Easter.
Right. They used it to talk about the death of their person or their God, right? And how that cycle lives on.
And the resurrection.
Well, right. Yeah. the idea that our souls live on, that souls continue in this world and are circular, gets played out. The value gets played out in the tradition of putting an egg on the table at an Ashkenazi Shiva house and hummus, chickpeas, on the tables at Sephardic. You're supposed to sit down, you see the round food, and you say, oh, life is circular. That soul will live on. Probably some people see it and they just see a hard-boiled egg, and other people see it and they just see chickpeas, and some people know what where the tradition is from, the value. But yes, we can be bound together by ethics. Usually the bonds are tighter when there's a do, an action in it, experiential. Najat, you were next, and then Bob Karp, you're next. And then I have two things.
Okay, well, this text really speaks to me, and I think it's time that I share my story with you. So I am from Morocco, and 8 years ago, I discovered that I was Jewish. Growing up in a secular Muslim family with no interest, like we never really cared about religion in my house, suddenly discovering that I was Jewish overwhelmed me, and I left Morocco and I went into a long journey that took me to Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, and now I found myself here and I changed jobs. I'm a teacher now, by the way. So all this time I was just curious about the cultural aspect of being a Jew, but moving to the United States for the first time of my life, I don't live in a Muslim country, so I have the opportunity to practice Judaism. And I am practicing American Judaism, if I may say, which has nothing to do with what we do in Morocco. So this text particularly that you asked me to read really touches me very deeply. And to come back to the mitzvah, I did put a mezuzah on my door. I am learning Hebrew. I'm trying to eat, as kosher as possible. Still having struggle with the shrimp, but we'll get there. Other than that, what I'm really surprised with is that the only thing that I knew about Islam, because that was my culture, was, all these rules that you have to respect and there is no discussion. And I was so surprised discovering Judaism, that I can actually talk about rules and not be afraid of speaking. And this is something that I find absolutely beautiful and that comforts me in my faith and in my identity. And I think just by your presence, all of you are doing your mitzvah for the day. So thank you very much. Yeah, and that's my story.
Is anyone else crying?
I'm crying.
We're crying. So we want to next time you're here, we'll talk, we'll get you, all these people want to invite you for a Shabbos meal.
I'm going to pass, Rabbi. You've got things to do next time.
No, go ahead. Go. You could say.
No. Well, okay. So I was in Tokyo at the Tokyo Jewish Center, and I met a young man who had decided he was Jewish, and his name. And I asked his email, and he said it was Joshua600@AOL.com. And I said, "Oh, I mean, there's that much need for that number?" So it went down. He said, "No, well, nobody's perfect." And I think the point is that we all
612.
Jews.
It was 612.
No, it was 600.
Okay.
Linda. In any case, well, the point I think is that we all have entry points to Jewish tradition. Mine happens to be the ethical commitments and the intellectual curiosity. Other people have other commitments, and they're all valid. They're all have elements of validity, but I guess suppose like the water and the wine, they can be overdone. Any of them can be overdone.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, the best part of your comment, we loved your comment, but we love the fact that there are two girsas, two different versions of that story on your page. Love that. Okay, so Elliot, quick, and then I have one thing about this.
Just
and
a
then
comment.
Yeah.
A comment for Najat. The New York Times published a list of what foods should be kosher. Heading the list for her is shrimp. So that was the head of their list. So you are not alone.
Okay, good. So Najat, we're gonna love getting to know you better and in our community. And thank you for being a teacher. So
thank you.
Chancellor Eisen really does add this idea, though, that there's the element of community. We don't necessarily make traditions by ourselves. And what we do, though, is we take our families and our communities and we build our families bigger. Maybe we bring people into our homes or into our lives, and we make tradition feel alive by both practicing it, but adding to it. By removing the pieces that feel so hard and harsh for us. Let me give you an example of that. How many of you do kaparas for Yom Kippur? So that is where you take a chicken and assign your sins to that chicken. And then you swing the chicken over your head. Anyone ever seen it?
Is it a joke, Rabbi?
No.
It's an old Jewish tradition. I've been on buses in Israel where before Yom Kippur, people are holding a chicken. So, yeah, you've seen it. It's really, so if you care for animals, it is just like PETA should be all over it. It's a terrible thing. And so we figured out a way to change that tradition. What do we do instead?
Tashlit.
3 pennies.
Yeah, people give money. There's a whole ceremony for doing tashlit without a chicken now. I know there are some folks who use a rubber chicken as a joke. They give the tzedakah, but they say, and we say, at what point does tradition have to change? Right? At what point? So here's a bigger example of it. How many of you grew up in a world where your mothers didn't count in the minyan? How many of you grew up where you didn't count in the minyan? Yeah. So we changed that tradition. We said we honor that tradition was. Not going to say that my grandmother must count in a minyan or my mother, but that now we're a fully egalitarian community. And in fact, we change tradition. How long does tradition take to change? Let me get three times, 3 generations. Suzanne, what are you saying about the 3?
It's what you said before.
Yeah, 3 times to take on something new. So there's a traditional change that's gone on in your lives, in the life of TJC that came before I got here. So, and that's that in the Amidah, we add the names of the matriarchs. That is not traditional in any way, right? Not one of you grew up saying Elohei, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, unless you grew up somewhere that I didn't know, or you're 10. But somehow, let's talk about this evolution. And I'm going to take questions and comments at the end because I got to get through a few more things, Mike. I see you have a hand raised, but I'll get back to you. In the early 70s, a couple women across the country started in the Chavurah movement, in the Reform movement. Some recons started saying Elohei Sarah. And then in the Reform movement, they said, let's add Ezrat Sarah. Let's add this. Conservative movement in 1985 publishes a prayer book, and Sim Shalom, it's a new prayer book, maybe it was earlier in the 80s, and doesn't add the matriarchs. And there's like this whole conversation. I was at the seminary a couple years later, and there was fights, like really fights. People would yell at each other. I don't want you to add those 4 righteous Jewish women because the walls might come down. And then there are other people who say, you have to add it. So then there comes a prayer book where it's on a B page. There's the Amidah that has just the traditional avot. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Or you could go to 39b and it would have it with the matriarchs. So many people who are a little bit further along on that would say to me, when are you getting rid of the B page? And they didn't mean we didn't want the matriarchs. They didn't want the option to just do the patriarchs. But the tradition had to slowly change. So within a maybe 20-year period, the next prayer book that came out is the one we use, Lev Shalem. And in Lev Shalem, the matriarchs are on the same page as the patriarchs, but they're in a parentheses. No one would get up and daven at TJC without adding the matriarchs, right? You wouldn't allow it.
Right.
But actually, when I was interviewing my interview weekend here, I didn't add V'imotenu once or twice. And people are like, is she not egalitarian? I just wasn't used to doing that. What will be the next evolution of that tradition? Yes.
Drop the patriarchs.
No.
Yeah, Marsha.
Drop the parentheses.
Drop the parentheses.
And
It'll happen. I promise you, it'll happen because traditions change. It'll happen. I want to end with one piece of text and a few ideas. The ideas are, I'd love for us to think about between this week and next week, what has changed in your Jewish life from the time you were a child till now? What would you like to change maybe? What traditions are out there that are large or small in your own living, your own life, your own Jewish experience? And I promise you, we're going to next week study something called our signature mitzvah. But if you go to the very next sheet, I'm going to read this one because it's really my very favorite text. I taught it my interview weekend here, and I teach it all the time, actually. It's based on, it's a precursor to next week. It's based on the verse in Hallel, in the Psalms of Praise, Pitchu li sha'arei tzedek, avovan odeya. Open for me the gates of righteousness, and I will go in and praise. Okay, we are now, this is now the Midrash, and it's from Midrash Tehillim, so a very late Midrash. Midrash again is what? Rabbinic stories that fill in the blanks. When there's not enough stories in the Torah to teach us what the rabbis meant, what the Torah meant, then the rabbis wrote stories. Midrash is like Aesop's fables. So this is a midrash on a story filling in what the verse "open the gates of righteousness" for me are. At the time of judgment, meaning le'olam haba, in the world to come, an angel will ask you as you enter the world to come, the pearly gates, or however you perceive of it, ma haya milachtech? What was your milacha? Anyone want to translate milacha? Can someone translate milacha?
Work. Creative work.
Creative work. Anyone else add to it?
I said kingdom. I don't know.
So milacha, it's work. I know milucha, kingdom. Milacha, work. Traditionally, milacha was all the work that was done to build the temple. That's how we define milacha. Any work that was done to build the temple, that was what was forbidden on Shabbat. Those were the work things that were forbidden on Shabbat. So they're saying, what was your sacred work? Here they translate, what is your occupation? That's not it. It's really the real midrash is, Maya melachtech, what was your sacred work? If the first person answers, Ma'achil re'evim ani, the angel will say, this is God's gate. You who feed the hungry may enter. Malbish arunim ani, I clothe the naked. And the angel will say, this is God's gate. You who clothe the naked may enter. And similarly, with those who raised orphans, any teachers, we consider teachers people who are raising orphans because their parents send them to you to learn. And anyone who performed the mitzvah of tzedakah, and anyone who did acts of loving kindness, and anyone, the midrash goes on, and Talmud Torah. So between this week and next week we're going to study an idea of signature mitzvah. I want you to think about mitzvot that are in the world. And now we're not going to define mitzvot for 2 years in this class. We're going to figure out what it means. But maybe it means what some of you said at the beginning, commandment. And maybe it also means holy action. Maybe it also means Jewish action. And maybe it's also good Jewish deeds. Not just good deeds, good Jewish deeds that bring about Jewish identity. So I'd love for you to think about this week. What are some Jewish actions or commandments or mitzvot that you like doing? Not that you have to do, but that you like doing, that are your signature mitzvot. So with that, I am going to say thank you. I'm going to say Shabbat Shalom. I'm also going to say that you have the whole packet, but if we need more readings, I will add them so that you can like read them a little bit before and we can discuss.